So picture this. It is the dead of night, right? The year is 1929. We are in this rural Hungarian village cemetery. The village is called Nagyrév.
And it's freezing.
Oh, completely freezing. The ground is literally frozen solid. And the only sound breaking the silence is this scraping of metal against dirt, the grunt of physical exertion, and the heavy, panicked breathing of these figures moving around in the shadows.
Right, and there are 13 of them.
Yeah, 13.
13 elderly women just wrapped in these thick wool shawls against the brutal cold. And they are frantically ripping up heavy stone grave markers.
It's just wild to visualize. These are village grandmothers, the matriarchs of the community.
Exactly. Physically lifting headstones and dragging them across the uneven ground in the pitch black.
Because they are orchestrating this massive, desperate shell game with human remains, right? They're trying to hide the exact locations of over 100 murdered men from an incoming police exhumation squad.
It's like something out of a movie, but it actually happened.
It totally did. And to understand how a baker's dozen of grandmothers end up running a midnight graveyard cover-up, we really have to rewind. We have to look at how an entire, seemingly quiet farming village transforms into a localized murder capital.
Absolutely.
So welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack one of the most astonishing, chilling, and honestly prolific murder rings in modern history, the angel makers of Nagyrév.
It's such a heady topic.
It is, and we are looking at an incredibly diverse stack of sources for you today. We've got historical archives, a literal Guinness World Records entry, medical journals on toxicology, and some brilliant modern analyses.
Yeah, like Patty McCracken's massive historical book, The Angel Makers, and Hope Reese's sociological essay, The Women Are Not Fine.
Exactly, because we aren't just looking at the mechanics of how these women poisoned potentially up to 300 people between 1911 and 1929. We are really dissecting the why.
And, the environment is really the only place to start. If you want to understand the genesis of a localized murder syndicate like this, you have to look at the geographical and social isolation of Nagyrév at the turn of the 20th century.
Right.
Because based on the historical research of Bella Bordeaux, this village was essentially an island. It was completely forgotten by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It sits about 60 miles southeast of Budapest, kind of pinched on a narrow peninsula between the meandering river Tisza and this massive oxbow lake.
And the geographic data in the archives is just wild. I mean, it wasn't just far away, it was physically inaccessible.
Oh, totally.
The dirt roads connecting Nagyrév to neighboring towns were essentially unpaved mud tracks. So for huge stretches of the year, like during the spring thaws or heavy rains, those roads flooded.
Yeah, they turned into knee-deep, impassable sludge.
Right. You literally could not leave, even if you desperately wanted to.
And that physical isolation bred this absolute authoritative isolation. You have a farming community of about 1,500 people, and the routine of daily life hadn't changed in hundreds of years.
Just entirely static.
Exactly. And most critically, there was no resident doctor, no hospital, and no functioning civil infrastructure. The only tenuous thread connecting this village to the state was a single county gendarme, a rural police officer.
And he barely even showed up.
Right. He might ride through every few weeks, mostly just to collect taxes or, hear petty grievances.
So into that total vacuum of authority, you have a society operating under this rigidly unyielding patriarchal system. The culture was predominantly Calvinist peasant stock.
Very traditional.
Yeah. We're talking about an era and a place where a teenage girl's husband was selected entirely by her parents.
And usually based on land consolidation, not affection. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You were told who to marry, you accepted it, and your fate was sealed.
Because divorce was socially, legally, and religiously impossible. The church offered absolutely no mechanism for dissolving a marriage, regardless of the circumstances.
Not at all.
And women held no legal rights over property, which meant leaving a marriage meant facing literal starvation. And if a woman spoke out about domestic violence, which the sociological sources indicate was rampant and totally normalized, she faced complete social ruin and physical retaliation.
There were zero safety nets. The community was entirely trapped by its own poverty and archaic social rules. I always think of it like a pressure cooker where the safety valve has just been welded shut.
That's a perfect analogy.
And then the outside world shatters that centuries-old routine. World War I breaks out in 1914. Suddenly, the Austro-Hungarian Empire remembers Nagyrév exists.
Because they need bodies for the meat grinder of the Eastern and Italian fronts.
Right, so the able-bodied men are conscripted and marched off to war.
And the immediate consequence of that is a total upending of the social order. The village is emptied of its patriarchal enforcers. The women are left behind to manage the households, raise the children, and perform the grueling physical labor of running the farms.
They literally had to do everything.
Everything. So out of pure necessity, they step into roles of authority. They are managing the finances, making crop decisions, and experiencing genuine, unadulterated autonomy for the first time in their lives.
And the wartime dynamic gets even more complex because of the prisoner of war situation.
The POWs.
Yeah, because Nagyrév was geographically isolated, pinched between the river and the lake, like you said. The Austro-Hungarian military decided it was a perfect, natural, open-air prison.
Which is pretty clever, actually.
It is. So they began housing Allied POWs, primarily Russian and Italian soldiers, in the immediate vicinity.
The military essentially used these POWs as forced agricultural labor to replace the drafted local men. But the reality on the ground was far less rigid than a prison camp.
Oh, way less rigid.
These foreign soldiers had a surprising amount of freedom to move about the village and work alongside the women.
And language barriers and enemy status apparently evaporated pretty quickly. The sources point out that many of these village women who were enjoying their newfound independence and, separated from husbands they were forced to marry in the first place, ended up taking these foreign prisoners of war as lovers.
It's fascinating.
It's wild. You have Russian and Italian men living in the homes, helping with the harvest, and creating a completely new, strangely liberated social dynamic right in the middle of a global conflict.
Yeah, for roughly 4 years, Nagyrév operated as a matriarchy, heavily subsidized by the labor and companionship of foreign prisoners.
But empires fall and wars end.
They do. By 1918, the Austro-Hungarian Empire has collapsed. The POWs are repatriated to their home countries, and the Hungarian husbands begin the long walk back to the village.
And the men returning from the trenches of World War I were completely fundamentally changed. They had survived artillery barrages, gas attacks, and the horrors of the Isonzo front.
They came back shattered.
Completely. Suffering from severe, untreated trauma, what we now understand as PTSD, many returned as alcoholics, relying on cheap local spirits to numb the psychological damage.
When you look at the sociology of this specific moment, it really resembles an invasive species being reintroduced to an ecosystem that has already adapted to its absence.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
These deeply traumatized, heavily armed men return to a village they expect to control. They demand total submission, expecting the social order to revert instantly to 1913.
Plus, the rumors of the women's affairs with the POWs are an open secret.
Right. The resulting domestic environment was explosive. The men unleashed their internalized rage and trauma on their wives through brutal, escalated domestic violence.
Just think about the psychological whiplash for these women. You've spent 4 years running your own life, experiencing agency, perhaps even genuine affection with a lover. Suddenly, your violent, traumatized husband returns, kicks the door in, demands your absolute obedience, and begins beating you for suspected infidelities.
And you can't escape.
You can't divorce him, you can't call the police because the gendarme only visits once a month and wouldn't intervene in a quote-unquote household matter anyway. You have this collision of newfound independence and returning inescapable patriarchal terror.
The state has failed them. The church has failed them. The geography traps them.
It's a nightmare.
When every single legal, religious, and social avenue for self-preservation is welded shut, desperation forces people to look outside the bounds of the law. Because the village was cut off, a massive power vacuum existed regarding medical and personal crisis intervention.
And stepping perfectly into that void is a woman who becomes the absolute architect of the village's dark secret.
Zuzana Fazekas.
Yes. Sometimes she's listed in the historical records as Julia or Suzanne, but her role in the village was indisputable. She arrived in Nagyrév around 1911.
And her arrival itself is shrouded in a massive red flag. She showed up without a husband, offering vague or contradictory explanations about his whereabouts, eventually claiming he had simply disappeared.
Very convenient.
Very. She was highly intelligent, resourceful, and quickly made herself the most indispensable person in the region.
The villagers called her a Tudosa Soni.
Right, a wise woman. In rural Hungarian peasant culture, this title carried immense weight. It was a blend of folklore, herbalism, and practical medicine.
And in a village where literacy was low and modern medicine was completely non-existent, the wise woman was the ultimate authority on life and death. Fazekas was the local midwife, the matchmaker, the veterinary surgeon, and the de facto doctor.
She was also the local abortionist.
Yeah, that's a huge detail. Between 1911 and 1921, Fazekas was arrested and put on trial 10 separate times for performing illegal abortions.
But she was acquitted every single time.
Every time. Judges continually let her walk free, which perhaps indicates that even the magistrates understood the sheer desperation of the women she was treating.
Her role as an abortionist is crucial for understanding her eventual pivot to murder. She was already accustomed to operating in the shadows, defying state law to provide women with bodily autonomy in a system that afforded them none.
She had their absolute trust.
Exactly. The female population trusted her completely. They brought her their deepest secrets, their unwanted pregnancies, and eventually their bruised and battered bodies.
Women would come to Fazekas's house in the dead of night, terrified, beaten by their returning veteran husbands, begging for some kind of intervention. And Fazekas didn't offer herbal teas or prayers.
No, her alleged response, documented in the lore of the trials, was terrifyingly pragmatic. She would look at these abused women and ask, why bother with them?
Just chillin'.
Fazekas didn't just offer sympathy. She offered a permanent, untraceable solution. She began manufacturing poison. And the method she utilized was this act of brutal agrarian chemistry. She turned to a ubiquitous household item of the era.
Arsenic-laced flypaper.
Yeah.
It is so bizarre to me to think about people just hanging sheets of deadly heavy metals from their kitchen ceilings to catch pests. But that was standard pest control in the 1920s?
Completely standard and entirely unregulated. Fazekas would purchase large quantities of this flypaper, bring it back to her home, and boil the sheets in pots of water or vinegar over her wood stove.
Just cooking up poison in her kitchen.
Exactly. As the paper broke down, the arsenic would leach out and rise to the surface as a toxic scum. She would carefully skim this lethal residue off the top, distill it, and bottle it in small pint vials, hiding them in her attic. She effectively built a bootleg arsenic factory right in the middle of town.
I was looking into the medical toxicology journals from our source stack to understand why arsenic was so incredibly popular as a weapon historically. It acts as a biochemical Trojan horse. To the naked eye, it is entirely odorless, colorless, and tasteless.
It's the perfect poison in that sense.
It really is. You could stir a lethal dose into a bowl of rich Hungarian goulash, a cup of strong black coffee, or a glass of brandy, and the victim would never detect a thing.
But the stealth aspect is only half of the equation. The true genius, if we can use that word for something so horrific, of using arsenic in this specific time and place lies in its symptoms.
Right. What does it actually do to the body?
Well, at a cellular level, arsenic mimics phosphorus. The human body readily absorbs it, attempting to use it to create ATP, which is the cellular energy currency. But arsenic blocks that process. It essentially suffocates the cells, particularly targeting the gastrointestinal tract.
And the result of that cellular suffocation is incredibly violent purging. The victim experiences excruciating stomach cramps, catastrophic vomiting, and severe diarrhea.
To a modern toxicologist, those are textbook signs of heavy metal poisoning. But in an impoverished rural village in the 1920s, observing a man rapidly dehydrating and purging his insides looked exactly like the waterborne diseases that routinely swept through those communities.
Oh, wow. So it blends right in.
Perfectly.
Yeah.
It perfectly mimics cholera, typhoid, or severe dysentery. It also mirrors the symptoms of acute alcohol poisoning, which was highly convenient given that many of the returning veterans were heavy drinkers.
So a man gets violently ill, spends 3 days in agony, and dies. The family assumes it's just a bad case of cholera. No one suspects foul play. And the only person with the medical authority to officially declare the cause of death to the state is Zuzana Fazekas herself.
Yep. She creates the poison, sells the poison, and then signs the paperwork classifying the murder as a natural tragedy.
Yeah.
She operated a perfectly closed loop.
I mean, you have to ask, though, how much of Fazekas' power came from her medical monopoly? Because I wonder, was she viewed as a savior by these women or a terrifying mafia boss they were too scared to cross?
It's a great question, and it probably shifted over time. But it is important to note that Fazekas didn't invent this concept out of thin air. The Guinness World Records entry for the Syndicate points to a chilling historical precedent known as the Mari Jager affair.
Right, this happened back in 1894 in a town just 60 kilometers away from Nagyrév. Mari Jager was another village midwife who ran a very similar, albeit smaller, arsenic poisoning ring using the exact same flypaper method.
So the knowledge that flypaper could be weaponized to silently remove abusive husbands was already embedded in the dark folklore of the region. The concept was in the cultural groundwater.
It wasn't a new idea.
No, what made Fazekas different from Mari Jager was her scale. Fazekas industrialized the process.
And based on the escalating body count, I really lean towards her becoming that terrifying mafia boss. Because initially she must have been viewed as a dark savior. A woman arrives bruised and broken, and Fazekas hands her a pint bottle that grants her immediate freedom. But as dozens of women become complicit, as the whole village becomes tied up in this conspiracy of silence, Fazekas knows everyone's darkest, most lethal secret.
Exactly. If you crossed her, she could destroy you with a single word to the gendarme. The dynamic of mutual assured destruction kept the village silent. Everyone was guilty, so no one could speak.
And this absolute lack of accountability is what catalyzed the next, far darker phase of the Angel Makers. What began, one could argue, as a desperate, horrific form of self-defense against domestic terror quickly mutated.
The psychological taboo of murder had been completely shattered. It was proven to be easy, it was proven to be undetectable, and human nature took over.
Yeah, the narrative of the oppressed victim fighting back completely falls apart when you look at who they started targeting next. The scope of the killings expanded from abusive husbands to literally anyone who was considered a financial burden or an inconvenience.
The historian Bella Bodo delves deeply into the practical cruelty of agrarian peasant culture. In a society where survival depends on extreme physical labor and resources are desperately scarce, anyone who consumes without contributing becomes a massive liability.
It's so bleak.
It is. The women began poisoning their elderly parents, disabled relatives, and sick family members.
Because they didn't have nursing homes and they didn't have the resources to care for them, so they just walked to Fazeka's house and bought a bottle of medicine. They poisoned lovers who had outlived their usefulness or threatened to expose affairs. But the most unfathomable targets were their own children.
Which is just, it's incredibly hard to wrap your mind around.
If a family had too many mouths to feed during a poor harvest, or if parents wanted to prevent their tiny plot of farmland from being subdivided among multiple heirs, they would systematically poison their own offspring.
And the sheer normalization of murder required a logistical network. Fazekas couldn't manage the escalating demand alone. She elevated a main accomplice, a woman named Suzy Ola, often referred to by the villagers as Auntie Suzy.
And she sounds absolutely terrifying.
Oh, she was a deeply feared figure, reputed to be a witch, and she essentially took on the role of chief distributor and enforcer. While Fazekas was in the attic boiling flypaper, Suzy Ola was walking the dirt roads, identifying potential quote-unquote clients.
She would visit women who were complaining about a sick parent or a drunken husband and casually suggest that perhaps the problem could be permanently resolved.
And they ran this operation like a highly structured predatory business. They instituted an actual financial installment plan for assassination.
Wait, really, an installment plan?
Let's break down the economics of a Hungarian peasant village in the 1920s. Cash was incredibly rare. Wealth was mostly tied up in livestock or grain. The syndicate charged an initial fee of 120 penges, which was roughly $20 at the time.
Which is a huge sum for them.
Massive. To a peasant woman, amassing 120 penges required severe risk and hoarding. But they didn't stop there. Another $20 was due immediately following the victim's funeral.
Okay, that's bold.
And the final, most predatory payment was extracted when the victim's estate was legally settled. Fazekas and Ola knew that once the husband or parent died, the widow would inherit the land, the house, or the livestock. The syndicate essentially placed a covert lien on the murder victim's estate.
It is literally a payment plan for serial murder. And they had a very strict code of conduct, right?
Yeah.
This service was exclusively provided to married women.
Correct. A spinster couldn't buy poison to kill a rival, and a man absolutely could not buy poison to kill his wife. It was a closed loop of matriarchal violence.
And when you read the specific anecdotes from the trial transcripts, the sheer detachment from human empathy chews you to the bone. You have to tell them about Marie Cardos.
Oh, the emotional disconnect these women developed is staggering. Consider the case of Marie Cardos. The records indicate she successfully poisoned her husband. Then she poisoned her lover.
Which is already 2 murders.
Right. But the violence didn't stop with romantic partners. She decided to poison her 23-year-old son.
The detail about her son is the one that really gets me. According to the testimonies, she gave him a lethal dose of arsenic. And as he lay in bed, enduring those agonizing stomach cramps, slowly suffocating at a cellular level, she sat by his bedside and made him sing to her.
It's just horrific.
She listened to his voice, knowing she had just murdered him, completely devoid of any maternal instinct or remorse.
It demonstrates a total psychological fracture. Another prominent case is Maria Varga. She systematically eliminated 7 members of her own extended family. And when she finally poisoned her husband, she was utterly brazen about it, reportedly telling her neighbors that she considered his death to be a personal Christmas present to herself.
Wow. And we need to stop at Widow Palinka, because we've been discussing this framework of desperate women trapped in abusive marriages, reacting to systemic failure. But Palinka kills 7 people. Her parents, her brothers, an aunt, a sister-in-law. Why? To inherit a house and a tiny 2.5-acre plot of dirt.
Yeah, that completely shatters the idea that these women were purely victims of patriarchy.
Exactly. This isn't self-defense. This is a cold-blooded, calculated real estate grab.
The evolution of the Syndicate undeniably crosses into sociopathic criminality. And Widow Palinka's methodology highlights the theatricality they developed to deflect suspicion. She would administer a sublethal dose of arsenic to her target, just enough to induce severe stomach cramps.
Just to make them look sick.
Right. Then she would put on a frantic, highly visible performance for the entire neighborhood. She would announce she was rushing to the city to buy expensive stomach medicine to save her beloved relative.
She would make a huge show of leaving, secure the medicine bottle, secretly dump out the actual medicine, and refill it with Fazekas's toxic flypaper water.
Precisely. She would return to the village, playing the role of the devoted caregiver, and generously dose her sick relative with the lethal mixture in front of witnesses. The neighbors would testify to her dedication, never realizing they were watching an execution.
It's just so twisted.
Even the leadership succumbed to petty vindictive motives. Suzy Ola, the distributor, poisoned her own second husband simply because he was a handsome man who was caught cheating on her. The motives had entirely devolved from desperate survival to simple greed, convenience, and spite.
The obvious question that screams from the source material is, how on earth did they get away with this for over 15 years? We are talking about a village of 1,500 people. You cannot have dozens, maybe hundreds of men and children dropping dead from sudden violent stomach ailments without someone connecting the dots.
You would assume the statistical anomaly alone would trigger an investigation. But the angel makers controlled the entire bureaucracy of death. As we discussed, Fazekas was the medical authority diagnosing the deaths as cholera.
Right.
But the administrative side was equally compromised. In the Austro-Hungarian system, a death certificate required specific stamps and signatures from the village clerk to be officially filed with the regional government.
And the village clerk of Nagyrév, the sole person responsible for reviewing and filing all the death certificates for the state, was Zuzana Fazekas's own cousin.
The fix was entirely in from top to bottom. Fazekas supplies the poison, the wife administers it, Fazekas medically declares it was a natural tragedy, and her cousin stamps the paperwork checking the appropriate boxes to ensure the regional authorities never see a reason to open an inquest.
It was a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of murder and bureaucratic cover-up.
But a house of cards that tall, built on the bodies of that many people, cannot stand forever. Eventually, Nagyrév became casually known in neighboring towns as the Murder District. Hubris always catches up.
So how did it finally fall apart?
The downfall of the Syndicate in 1929 is as dramatic as the crimes themselves, though historians debate the exact catalyst. There are 3 conflicting accounts in the records regarding how the authorities in the nearby city of Szolnok were finally tipped off.
Let's lay out the 3 theories. The first one sounds very CSI, very forensic.
The first account states that a medical student in a neighboring town was examining a body that had washed up on the banks of the river Tisa. During his examination, he detected extraordinarily high levels of arsenic in the tissues. This anomaly prompted him to alert the regional authorities, which sparked a broader investigation into the alarming death rates in the Tisazog region.
It's a neat scientific explanation. But historian Bella Badeau leans toward a different catalyst, doesn't he?
He does. Bodo's research points to a whistleblower. He states that the murders were finally brought to light when an anonymous letter was mailed to the editor of a local newspaper, the Szolnoki Újság. The letter explicitly accused the women of Nagyrév and the surrounding villages of poisoning their family members en masse.
So it was a leak from inside the conspiracy.
Exactly. But the third account, which was splashed across the international newspapers at the time, is the most narrative and frankly the most believable in a village run on gossip. It involves the precentor of Nagyrév, a local church official who leads the congregation in singing.
I love this one.
According to this widely reported account, the precentor came home one night, heavily intoxicated. His wife, frustrated by his drinking, began to loudly complain and argue with him. A neighbor, A woman named Frau Sabot overheard the commotion through the walls.
And she decides to intervene.
Yep, she approached the presenter's wife and offered a simple solution. She offered to sell her the poison, casually admitting that she had used it to successfully eliminate her own husband and her brother when they became bothersome.
And the wife actually tells her drunk husband about this incredibly illegal, lethal offer.
She does. The presenter, suddenly terrified and profoundly sobered by the realization that his life was in imminent danger, bypasses the local gendarme entirely. He travels directly to the regional police headquarters in the city of Szolnok and reports the conversation.
Which is smart, considering the local cop is probably compromised anyway.
Yeah.
Whichever account was the actual spark, or perhaps it was a combination of all three reaching the authorities simultaneously, the police finally take notice. Detectives are dispatched from Szolnok to Nagyrév, and the lead investigator, a man named Detective Bartok, sets a brilliant psychological trap.
Bartok knows he is walking into a hostile, tightly knit community that will protect its own. So he brings Zuzana Fazekas in for questioning. He interrogates her intensely, but Fazekas is iron-willed. She denies everything.
She doesn't crack.
Not at all. She knows the police have rumors, but they lack physical proof. So Bartok makes a tactical decision. He lets her go. He releases her back into the village.
Detective Bartok didn't just let her walk away, though. He knew exactly what he was doing. He let her out so he could follow her.
He understood that isolation and pressure breed paranoia. Fazekas thought she had outsmarted the provincial police, but she was terrified. She knew there was a leak, and she needed to ensure the rest of the syndicate kept their mouths shut.
Right.
Under the cover of darkness, she sneaks out of her house and begins a frantic, door-to-door campaign through the village.
It is the ultimate mafia movie trope playing out in real life. The paranoid boss realizes the feds are sniffing around, so they frantically try to plug the leaks, visiting all their top lieutenants to enforce silence.
Exactly.
But in doing so, with Detective Bartok tailing her through the shadows, she unwittingly hands the police a comprehensive physical map of the entire criminal organization. She leads them right to the doorsteps of the most prolific killers.
By attempting to secure the conspiracy, she gave the police their primary suspect list. But suspects are not convictions. To secure warrants, the police needed evidence of poison, and to get that, they needed bodies.
And word inevitably leaks out to the village that the police are securing legal permission to exhume the graves in the local cemetery.
Which brings us right back to our opening scene. The syndicate knows the authorities are coming for the bodies.
The panic that must have ripped through that village is unimaginable.
This results in the cinematic, eerie moment Detective Bartok witnesses. He stakes out the cemetery at night and watches 13 elderly women, led by Suzy Ola, desperately trying to shuffle the heavy stone headstones around in the freezing dark.
They aren't just moving dirt, they are trying to outsmart a forensic investigation.
Right.
Because if the police have a warrant to dig up the grave of a man suspected of being murdered, but the women have moved his headstone over the grave of a man who genuinely died of tuberculosis, the forensic tests will come back clean, and the evidence vanishes. It is a brilliant, terrifyingly bold cover-up attempt.
But Bartok catches them in the act. He blows his police whistle, backup surges into the graveyard, and the 13 women are arrested right there among the displaced stones. The physical operation of the angel makers is finally halted.
So the suspects are in custody. But the police face a massive, daunting forensic hurdle. How do you definitively prove a murder occurred on a body that has been buried in the earth for 5, 10, or even 15 years?
This is where the fatal flaw in Fazekas' seemingly perfect weapon is exposed. Fazekas operated on soak knowledge. She believed that arsenic, once ingested and processed by the body, would eventually dissipate or become entirely untraceable as the organic matter decomposed in the grave.
She fundamentally misunderstood the chemistry of heavy metals.
It was a fatal scientific error. Arsenic is an elemental heavy metal. It is highly stable and entirely non-reactive. It does not degrade over time, no matter how long it sits in the earth.
Wow.
The regional authorities brought in 2 country doctors, Imre Orsos and Isidor Kanitz, to conduct the autopsies on the exhumed villagers.
I was reading the forensic breakdown in the sources, and the resilience of this poison is terrifying. The body itself might be entirely skeletonized, all the soft tissue completely gone, but the arsenic remains perfectly sequestered in the keratin-rich tissues that survive decomposition.
Yeah, Doctors Orsos and Kanitz found massive, lethal concentrations of arsenic perfectly preserved in the victim's hair and in the dark, telltale splotches under their fingernails.
Which is incredible.
Even more incredibly, because the arsenic doesn't break down as the body's slowly decomposed over a decade. The poison leached out of the remains into the surrounding environment.
The soil itself became a witness.
Exactly. The doctors were able to run chemical tests and reliably detect lethal doses of arsenic soaked into the burial shrouds, embedded in the rotting wooden boards of the coffins, and heavily concentrated in the dirt directly beneath the bodies.
The earth was literally testifying against the women of Nagyrév.
Once the women in custody realized that the forensic science was infallible, that the bodies could speak from beyond the grave, absolute panic set in. The Syndicate began to violently self-destruct. Several of the women, particularly the ringleaders who knew the gallows awaited them, chose to take their own lives.
Zuzana Fazekas, the architect who started it all, realized she was completely cornered. While some early sensationalist newspapers claimed she was hanged, the most widely accepted and poetic historical records state she committed suicide in her own home before she could be fully processed.
It's fitting, in a dark way.
She was found dead, surrounded by the pots she used to boil the flypaper, having consumed a massive dose of her own lethal concoction.
She died by the very biochemical weapon she profited from.
Oh.
The suicide of Balantzordus, who is described in several sources as the vice president of the Syndicate, is particularly gruesome and speaks to the desperation they felt.
Oh, yeah. The archives mention she actually traveled to a chemist in the city under false pretenses. She asked the chemist, hypothetically, if arsenic leaves traces in a body long after death.
And the chemist explained the exact science of heavy metals concentrating in the hair and fingernails.
Realizing there was no escaping the forensic evidence, Tsordis returned home, bypassed the arsenic, and drank a glass of lye, a highly corrosive alkaline chemical used for clearing pipes. She died in horrific, burning agony rather than face a public execution.
Just brutal. For those who didn't take their own lives, the wheels of justice began to turn. And the scale of this criminal investigation was entirely unprecedented for rural Hungary.
The authorities essentially had to commandeer the village.
They turned the cemetery's receiving vault into a massive temporary morgue. Over 100 bodies were exhumed from the frozen ground and tested for heavy metals. Between 1929 and 1931, 12 separate, highly publicized trials were held in the provincial capital of Szolnok.
The courtroom scenes must have been absolute chaos. You have an entire village testifying against itself, neighbors pointing fingers to save their own necks, and the final numbers regarding the accused are staggering.
29 women and 2 men husbands who were found to be complicit in the murders of other relatives were put on trial. However, the prosecution faced a significant legal hurdle regarding the burden of proof.
Because finding arsenic in a grave isn't enough to convict someone.
Right. While they had the chemical evidence of arsenic in the graves proving a murder happened, in many cases, it was nearly impossible to definitively prove who physically administered the poison.
Because if the widow denies she gave it to him and there are no living witnesses, it's circumstantial. You can't put someone in the gallows purely on suspicion.
Because of that high burden of proof, out of the dozens accused and the hundreds of bodies tested, only 16 people were ultimately convicted.
Only 16.
Only 16. The sentences handed down ranged from lengthy prison terms to life imprisonment, and for the worst offenders, death by hanging. Suzy Ola, the fearsome distributor who turned the murders into a lucrative installment business, was one of those executed.
And their convictions lead directly to their entry in the Guinness World Records. They officially hold the record for the most prolific murder ring.
But looking at the sources, I have to ask you about the massive discrepancy in the numbers.
Body count.
Yeah. The Guinness entry confirms at least 40 murders. Historian Bella Baudot estimates between 45 and 50, based on court records. But then there are widespread historical rumors and international articles claiming the death toll was as high as 300.
That's a huge gap.
Why is there a gap of 250 bodies? How much of that 300 number is a mathematical reality, and how much is just media sensationalism about a village of killer women?
It is almost certainly a combination of both statistical reality and media frenzy. The confirmed numbers, the 40 to 50 range, are based strictly on the hard forensic evidence recovered during the exhumations and the resulting legal convictions. Those are the undeniable, court-proven facts.
Okay, so where does the 300 come from?
Well, the 300 figure derives from several compelling factors. First, investigators noted a massive demographic anomaly. When they reviewed census and parish records, they realized that in a village of roughly 1,500 people, the death rate of healthy adult men and children over an 18-year period was statistically absurd. It defied all actuarial logic.
And they simply didn't test everyone.
Right.
Precisely. The exhumations were eventually halted due to the sheer financial cost and logistical nightmare of processing that many remains. The provincial government couldn't afford to dig up and run chemical assays on every single person who died since 1911.
Right.
They stopped digging, meaning there were likely dozens, if not hundreds, of bodies left in the ground that were never tested.
Add to that the fact that the global press descended on Hungary. You had journalists from London and New York writing sensationalized dispatches about the murder district and the vampire women of Nagyrév.
It was a very salacious story for the 1920s.
The narrative of an entire village of murderous women was incredibly lucrative for newspapers. So while 300 might be an inflation driven by the press to sell papers, given that the ring operated completely unchecked for 18 years, the true number of victims is undoubtedly far, far higher than the 45 that were officially proven in a court of law.
The trials ended, the ringleaders were executed or imprisoned, and the village of Nagyrév slowly faded back into obscurity, burdened with a horrific legacy. But the intellectual and historical fascination with this case never died.
No, it really hasn't.
It has endured for a century, captivating modern historians, sociologists, and authors who are still obsessed with trying to unravel the psychology of mass complicity.
And unraveling a century-old Hungarian murder conspiracy requires an immense, almost punishing amount of dedication. The source material details the staggering lengths that author Patty McCracken went to in order to piece this narrative back together for her book, The Angel Makers.
The methodology behind her research is a story in itself. It demonstrates the grueling reality of deep historical investigation.
It is truly mind-blowing. She didn't just read a few Wikipedia articles. She spent 14 years researching this single book.
14 years.
She actually moved to Hungary just to be physically close to the archives. She hired a dedicated translator, Attila Tokay, to painstakingly go through thousands of pages of 1920s trial transcripts, police reports, and local Hungarian newspaper articles, deciphering the peasant dialects and legal idioms of the era.
One of the most fascinating details from her process was her use of historical weather archives.
That blew my mind. Why look up the weather?
Because if a woman was on the witness stand claiming she innocently walked to the next village to buy legitimate medicine on a specific Tuesday, McCracken would cross-reference that date with the meteorological data.
Oh, that's brilliant.
If the archives showed a torrential downpour that day, which would have turned the dirt roads into knee-deep, impassable mud, McCracken knew the woman was lying under oath. She reconstructed the crime scenes with forensic meteorological accuracy.
She built a massive, interconnected timeline on butcher paper spanning the walls of her house. But immersing oneself in such sustained, concentrated darkness for over a decade takes a profound psychological toll.
It really does.
The sources mention she became so utterly consumed by unearthing the truth of these women that her own life derailed. She lost her Austrian visa, became essentially homeless, moved to a quiet house-sitting gig on Martha's Vineyard just to isolate herself, and wrote obsessively.
And the article notes that when she finally finished the manuscript after 14 years, she walked outside, sat down under a scrub oak tree, and just wept.
She felt a crushing responsibility to tell the story accurately, without reducing these women to simple caricatures of evil.
And that desire for nuance brings us to the sociological analysis that researchers like McCracken and Hope Reese, the author of The Women Are Not Fine, bring to the table today. We must look at this case not merely as a true crime anomaly or a sensational horror story, but as a deeply disturbing historical mirror.
I was reading Hope Reese's piece, along with the analysis from She Thrives, and they pose a very stark warning from history. They use the Nagyrév case to fundamentally challenge the binary narrative of good and evil. They argue that you can't just write these women off as inherent born monsters.
The sociological argument presented in these sources posits that when systemic failure is absolute, when the law, the church, the culture, and the geography uniformly abandon a demographic and leave them exposed to daily violent abuse, it creates a pressure cooker that breeds extreme, horrific, collective actions.
The thesis is that the angel makers were not an isolated outbreak of madness, but a desperate, albeit terrifying, form of localized social rebellion born from total, suffocating despair.
The fundamental question these modern researchers pose is, what happens to a community when women's suffering goes entirely unanswered by the society they live in?
It's crucial to clarify as we synthesize these sources that applying this sociological lens doesn't absolve the women of the murders. The researchers aren't excusing the fact that they poisoned their own children or murdered relatives for 2 acres of land.
Not at all.
They are using this analytical framework to understand the genesis of the crime. They are trying to map the exact coordinates where systemic neglect morphs into mass sociopathy.
It is an analysis of the mechanics of mass complicity, exploring how normal people can be driven to normalize the unthinkable when trapped in a completely broken system.
But I want to highlight the deeply disturbing irony here, an irony that I think makes this case so uniquely haunting. These women started the Syndicate, allegedly, to murder their abusers and gain autonomy over their own lives. They wanted to escape living in perpetual fear of violence.
Right.
But by adopting this ruthless, lethal method, they ultimately became the terrorizing abusers themselves.
They perfectly replicated the exact dynamic of fear, control, and violence that they were trying to escape, simply reversing the gender role.
Exactly. There is a chilling quote from one of the historical records where a visiting priest noted the atmosphere in Nagyrév during the height of the Syndicate. He observed that the village was completely dominated by women, and all the surviving men walked around terrified for their lives.
They were afraid to eat.
Men were reportedly afraid to eat the food their wives put in front of them, terrified of their own coffee cups. The women successfully eliminated patriarchal abuse, but they replaced it with a matriarchal syndicate of lethal extortion. They became the monsters they were running from.
It is the ultimate tragic irony of the angel makers. Violence begat violence, and it entirely poisoned the community, both literally in their bodies and metaphorically in their souls.
Let's pull all of this incredible dark history together. We started with a tiny farming village, completely trapped by mud and geographic isolation, suffering under rigid patriarchal rules and post-war trauma.
We watched the rise of Zuzana Fazekas, a wise woman, who weaponized flypaper and turned desperation into a booming, structured business with installment plans for murder.
We covered the dramatic midnight arrests in the graveyard, the stubborn, undeniable science of heavy metals leaching into the soil, and the modern historians who have sacrificed years of their lives to unravel the complex sociology of this dark chapter.
It remains one of the most profound historical mirrors we have, showing us the horrifying extremes of human behavior when societal structures fail to protect the vulnerable, and how quickly survival can curdle into unbridled greed.
It absolutely does. And before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. Something that has been nagging at the back of my mind since I first opened this stack of research.
What does that?
Think about the sheer razor-thin luck involved in their downfall. If that one medical student hadn't stumbled upon that single body washed up on the riverbank, or if the precentor's wife hadn't gotten angry at her drunk husband and told him about Frau Szabo's lethal offer, how much longer would the angel makers of Nagyrév have operated?
The flypaper was dirt cheap.
The arsenic was untraceable to the naked eye, and the clerk filing the state paperwork was in on the scam.
It was a practically impenetrable, perfectly self-sustaining system.
It really makes you wonder, how many other isolated pockets of history harbor massive, perfectly executed crimes just like this? Crimes that didn't have a clumsy accomplice, or a bragging neighbor, or a whistleblower writing an anonymous letter to a newspaper. How many local lethal syndicates operated undetected, their dark secrets remaining safely buried under undisturbed headstones to this very day?
It is a truly chilling prospect. The criminal conspiracies we study in history are only the ones who eventually made a mistake.
A terrifying thought to leave on.